Seeking Wisdom Week 25, the Temple, the Sign of God's Presence, the books of Haggai and Zechariah. To begin this week, let's look at the authors of the books. Zechariah is up first. Zechariah hails from priestly lineage, and after nearly 20 years in exile, around 520 BC, he prophesied in Jerusalem. He spent his days encouraging people to complete the temple, which had already been delayed 15 years due to a lack of funds and the rebuilding being protested by the Samaritans. Ezra chapter 5 verse 1 tells us that the prophets Zechariah and Haggai encouraged the Jews to complete the temple, with Haggai being the first to voice his encouragement. Now let's look at Haggai. Haggai, which means holiday or festival, was active for only about 4 months, from August to December 520 BC, under the reign of King Darius I. The purpose of the book of Haggai comes from the great need to rebuild the temple. While preaching to the Jews and encouraging them to complete the temple, he told them that drought and crop failure would be a direct result of indifference to the building of the temple. This temple was a glue that would bond those that had just returned from exile and those that remained in exile. While in exile, God's people did not have a temple due to circumstances beyond their control. When God's people were able to return to their ancestral homeland, a temple was an absolute necessity. This temple would become a sign of God's presence among his people so he can bless them, and it would become the center of the religious life in the community. The building of the temple had become a way of protecting the faith of God's people, because while in exile there was a constant threat of paganism that harmed those who remained in Jerusalem, and this threat could compromise their repatriation. Therefore, Zechariah urged God's people to complete the temple with the backing of Haggai, Zerubbabel the governor, and Joshua the high priest. And 4 years later, the temple was finally complete, and the Lord said happily to the people, "I am with you." Haggai and Zechariah knew that the quicker the temple was completed, the quicker God would have a place to dwell among his people in Jerusalem forever. Remember when we learned that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the most holy place as a sign of the presence of God? Well, after the exile with no Ark of the Covenant because it had been either lost or destroyed during battle, the temple became of great significance to the faith of the Israelites. Perhaps the Ark of the Covenant was used to symbolize God's presence. Throughout their time in exile, God's people knew how to worship God spiritually through reading and meditating on God's laws. But Haggai saw the need for the temple as a meeting place to teach God's word. And after the completion of the temple, God delighted and revealed his glory, dwelling in the temple among his people, all the while knowing his people were scattered all over the country, but had a central meeting place to worship. In his delight, he showed his glory to the Gentiles and tells them he is the Lord of heaven and earth and God of all nations. It was this show of glory that united his people, and the temple that reminded the Israelites of God's promise to King David, creating a hope of a good material life. Now we will look more closely at the book of Zechariah. Today, all biblical scholars agree that the book of Zechariah is not written by just one person, simply because it consists of 2 different parts written at different times. Part 1, chapters 1 to 8, was written by Zechariah, who seemed to be a contemporary of the prophet Haggai. And Part 2, chapters 9 to 14, is written later by either one or many authors. This part is known as the second part of Zechariah and should be studied separately. Part 1 was wrote by Zechariah himself, and based on the information in the book of Ezra and Haggai, we can conclude that Zechariah lived at the same time as Haggai, and together they undertook the responsibility of urging the Israelites, after returning from exile, to rebuild the temple. Zechariah preached from 520 until 518 BC, and like Haggai, had visions of and heard the words of God. Both of these prophets emphasized Jerusalem as a place where the Lord dwells and the rebuilding of the temple. But in Zechariah chapters 1 to 8, we see that Joshua actually had a more important role than Haggai. and Zerubbabel had a key role in the reconstruction of the temple. Zechariah chapters 1 to 8 was quite obviously written to address the people in Jerusalem, specifically the Jews, either those that remained in the country or those that returned from exile. This part of the book is written to reiterate the importance of the Jews actively participating in the reconstruction of the temple, which is a gathering point of God's people and his presence among the people. Zechariah's experience in exile made it possible for him to show God's people that he would be present among them always, even during difficult times. This absolute faith and belief show the Israelites that God will bring destruction upon the enemies of his people, supporting the need for the rebuilding of the temple and the renewal of their sacrifices in order to receive the grace of the Lord. Part 2 of Zechariah, or chapters 9 to 14, an anonymous author added to the book, and it has been difficult to determine the date of compilation. But it is believed to have been written around the period of the Greek imperialist expansion to the rebellion of Maccabees, so between 330 and 166 BC. The book of Zechariah's main purpose is to send words of encouragement to the people of Jerusalem as they were dealing with invasion by other nations and the siege they were under. These books wrote of how God would avenge the people of Jerusalem, and their suffering they were enduring would one day come to an end. The prophecy that foretold this better time in their lives foretold of a time when God will spurt up a stream to purify all and cause all nations to flow to Jerusalem to worship him and give us everlasting life. Zechariah chapters 1 to 8 are simply meant to encourage God's people to continue with the reconstruction of the temple so that they too may have a bright future. All through these chapters, we see many different examples of ways different prophecies were able to address the people with their visions and words from God. A few examples are chapter 8, verse 3. Darius proclaimed the future glory of Jerusalem. Chapter 8, verses 8 to 17 tells of how if people faithfully worship God, their sins will be forgiven and they will enjoy happiness in a peaceful setting. Chapter 2, verses 10 to 13, and chapter 8, verses 20 to 23 tells of how Jerusalem will be the religious center of the world and many people will come there to worship. Chapter 3, verses 8 to 10, and chapter 6, verses 12 to 13 shows how Zechariah saw that Zerubbabel was the embodiment of the Messiah of David's lineage, but ever faithful to the prophet Ezekiel, he also praised the high priest Joshua. When Joshua and Zerubbabel are both anointed and Joshua becomes the religious leader of the community, he is standing at the right hand of Zerubbabel, the king of Messiah. The high priest and the king work closely together and build the community. Last but not least, do you remember when Jeremiah announced, "A sprout will appear from David's house"? Therefore, this must mean that the Messiah must be a monarch, and the Messianic era should be a time of righteousness and love. It can be said that Zechariah foretold of the Savior more than any other prophets except Isaiah. Christ is a sprout. Christ is the servant. Christ enters Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. Christ is the good shepherd. Christ the shepherd was beaten. Christ is sold for 30 silver coins. Pierced heart of Christ. Christ ascended the mountain of Olive. This has become the model of Christ, who will sit on a glorious throne when he returns to earth to establish his everlasting kingdom, and all kings will submit to him at his feet. We will conclude today's lesson by learning about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, otherwise known as the Church of the Holy Tomb, in present-day Jerusalem. Many people have traveled to the Holy Land thinking this is a place that has been repeatedly mentioned in the Gospels. But the temple in the Gospels was destroyed in 70 AD, and this is now known as the Church of the Holy Tomb, or the Church of the Resurrection, which is where Jesus was crucified on the cross, and Calvary, which is where Jesus was buried and rose again after 3 days. The Church of the Holy Tomb is located in the ancient city of Jerusalem, is the church of many Christian denominations, and is considered one of the holiest places on earth. This church has become a very important pilgrimage site for devotees since the 4th century. The Church of the Holy Tomb is built on the last 4 stages of what Catholics know as the Stations of the Cross and is crowded with many other structures around it. According to the historical timeline of the church, it has experienced many ups and downs, has been completely destroyed, and yet still exists today. According to some documents that were found, the first Christians in Jerusalem worshipped in this very church and performed rituals at Jesus' tomb right up until 70 AD, when the city was invaded by the Romans. This was when Emperor Hadrian leveled this place and built a pagan church above it, which stood until 326 BC, when Emperor Constantine I destroyed the pagan temple and rebuilt a new temple. While the ground was being dug up to start the new temple, Emperor Constantine's mother found the cross that Jesus had been crucified on near the tomb of Jesus. Then in 614, the Persians invaded Jerusalem, and all of the hard work on the new church was destroyed by fire and severely damaged. But once again, the church was restored, and then once again destroyed, this time by the Muslims in the 11th century. In 1099, the Crusader army advanced into Jerusalem and recaptured the Church of the Holy Tomb and many other churches from the Muslims and proceeded to rebuild the church. Over the next many years, the Church of the Holy Tomb experienced everything from destruction to invasion to neglect, and recovery efforts never proved effective during this time. The Church of the Holy Tomb is believed to be the place where Jesus was buried and resurrected, and this is also the church that had been rebuilt 4 times, as recently as 1810. The Church of the Holy Tomb is considered a common property of the sects, meaning ownership lies in the hands of the Roman Catholic Church, the Armenian Church, and the Greek Orthodox Church. The ownership and use of the church has been done following an agreement since the 18th century, but like any other agreement, there is sometimes disputes, and some of the disputes in the case of the church have led to violence. The lack of trust between the joint owners of the church have led to a neutral party, in this case a Muslim family, holding the key for the church and unlocking and locking the doors, a tradition dating back to the 12th century. When we look back at the reconstruction of the temples under the prophets Zechariah and Haggai and the Shrine of the Holy Land, there were many ups and downs, and we all must admit to the fragility of a temple built of wood or even stone. The one thing we must always remember is that the temple is truly a sign of God's presence among His people and cannot be confined to a building or confined space. St. Paul repeatedly reminds us that our body is God's temple, where God is present and glorified. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this week's lesson. Please join us next Friday for our new video. The answers to this week's questions will be revealed in next week's video. Remember, every Friday at 7 p.m., the Seeking Wisdom Challenge will be posted on YouTube and Facebook. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, or subscribe to our channel. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and we wish you a wonderful weekend full of grace and joy.